This D-bag at a BBQ wouldn't stop insulting me and challenging me to a swim race. He didn't know I was on the Olympic team. I was flipping burgers at my girlfriend Harper's family barbecue when her sister showed up with her new boyfriend Craig, who immediately started telling everyone about the pool he'd just installed at his house since he was basically a professional swimmer. Harper squeezed my hand and whispered, "Wow, so impressive." She knew about my 4 years on the Olympic swim team, but I'd never mentioned it to her family since I didn't want to be that guy who peaked in college. Craig cornered me at the grill, beer in hand, and started going on about his swimming prowess. "I actually had to get kicked out of the club pool last month," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The other swimmers complained to management that I was making them uncomfortable because I was so much faster. I mean, when you're lapping everyone twice, it gets embarrassing for them, you know?" He looked at me expectantly like I should be impressed. I nodded politely and kept flipping burgers while Harper rolled her eyes beside me. Craig looked me up and down, taking in my dad bod that had replaced my swimmer's build after 5 years of retirement. "You ever swim, Dylan? No offense, but you don't really have the body for it. I mean, look at these shoulders," he said, rotating his arms to show off. "Swimming is all about the wingspan and the core. You've got more of a softball build." He laughed at his own joke while I just smiled and shrugged. Harper's sister tried to change the subject, but Craig was just getting started. "It's not your fault, man. Black guys just aren't built for swimming. It's a scientific fact, something about bone density or muscle fibers. That's why you never see them in the Olympics." Harper's jaw dropped and she started to say something, but I touched her arm gently and whispered, "Let him talk. This is actually hilarious." Craig must have taken my silence as agreement because he kept going. "I'm not being racist, it's just biology. Like, when's the last time you saw a black swimmer win anything? Michael Phelps, Ryan Lochte, all the greats are white. It's just how it is." He shrugged like he was doing me a favor by explaining this. Even Harper's dad looked uncomfortable now, but I just kept that same easy smile on my face. After a few beers, Craig decided to demonstrate his perfect butterfly form on the grass, flopping around like a fish while explaining his technique. "See, Dylan? It's all about the dolphin kick. I bet you don't even know what that is. My coach said I had natural talent you can't teach. Some people got it, some don't." He stood up, grass stains on his polo, completely serious about his performance. When Harper mentioned I used to swim in college, Craig laughed so hard he nearly choked on his beer. "Community college had a swim team? That's cute. Let me guess, you did the doggy paddle relay?" He turned to his girlfriend and said, "No wonder Harper's dating him. She always liked charity cases. Remember that guy with the limp?" Harper's face went red and she snapped, "Dylan went to Stanford, you ass." But I just smiled and said, "Harper, relax." Craig pulled out his phone to show everyone videos of him swimming, narrating each one. "This is me destroying everyone at my gym. See that guy I just lapped? He said he swam Division 3. Pathetic." Then he turned to me and said, "Dylan probably thinks the shallow end is an accomplishment. Different leagues, bro. I'm talking about real swimming, not whatever you did at the YMCA." The videos were clearly sped up, but I didn't bother pointing it out. The afternoon got worse when Craig started lying about his times, claiming he could swim a 50-meter freestyle in under 20 seconds, which would be a world record. "I never went pro because I make too much money in sales. Why make pennies swimming when I can afford my own pool?" "Dylan, what do you do again?" Harper mentioned something about coaching kids. "What do you coach them in, burger flipping?" He gestured at the grill and laughed. "That's sweet though, giving back to the community since you never made it yourself." I actually laughed at that one because the irony was too perfect. Finally, Craig had drunk enough to issue his challenge. He stood up, swaying slightly, and announced to everyone, "You know what? Let's settle this right now. Dylan, get in my pool and race me, right now. Unless you're scared to lose in front of your girl." He pulled off his shirt dramatically. "Come on, man. One lap. Unless you admit you can't swim and I'm superior in every way. What's it gonna be? You gonna hide behind Harper or are you gonna be a man?" Harper looked at me with an expression that said she was completely done with this guy. "Oh my God, just do it already," she said, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Craig stood there smirking, thinking he was about to humiliate me in front of everyone, having no idea he'd just challenged someone with 4 NCAA titles and an Olympic trials record that still hadn't been broken. So I said, "Sure, man. One lap." Craig grabbed his keys off the table and started walking toward his car, while everyone else looked at each other trying to figure out the logistics. Harper's dad stepped in and took the keys from Craig's hand, saying nobody was riding with someone who'd been drinking that much. Craig protested, but his girlfriend grabbed his arm and steered him toward her car, while Harper and I headed to mine with her parents following in theirs. The whole convoy of cars pulled out of the driveway with Craig hanging out the passenger window of his girlfriend's car, yelling about how I was about to learn what real swimming looked like. Harper squeezed my hand tight as we drove and whispered she couldn't wait to see his face when he realized what he'd gotten himself into. I kept my eyes on the road and focused on staying calm, because even though it had been 5 years since I'd competed seriously, my body still remembered what it felt like to destroy someone in the water. Craig's house was only 10 minutes away, and when we pulled up I had to admit his pool setup was actually pretty nice. The pool stretched 25 yards with proper lane lines and everything, though I could tell from the way the lane ropes sat loose that he probably never bothered setting them up right. Craig immediately started his tour explaining how he'd personally designed every aspect for optimal training conditions and maximum speed development. He pointed at the shallow end saying that's where beginners usually stayed, and then gestured at the deep end where real swimmers trained. Everyone just wanted to see the race happen, but Craig kept going on about the filtration system and the special tiles he'd chosen and how the depth was perfect for generating the right kind of waves. I walked over to check the water while he talked and suggested we should probably set some ground rules for safety since he'd been drinking pretty heavily all afternoon. Craig waved his hand, dismissing my concern, and said real swimmers didn't need rules because the water was their natural element. Harper's dad spoke up firmly, saying we absolutely needed to be smart about this, and nobody was getting in that pool without some basic safety measures in place. Craig rolled his eyes, but his girlfriend agreed with Harper's dad, so he had to go along with it. That's when Craig started pulling off his clothes right there on the pool deck, and I realized he was stripping down to his underwear since he didn't have swim trunks at his own house. Everyone got real uncomfortable real fast, and Harper's sister finally convinced him to at least keep his shorts on, even though he complained they would create drag and slow him down. I mentioned we should probably have someone neutral time this to make sure it was fair for both of us, and Craig immediately scoffed, saying I was already making excuses before we even got started. Several people agreed it made sense to have an official timekeeper though, and Harper's mom volunteered to use her phone's stopwatch since she didn't care who won. Craig started his warm-up routine, which consisted of aggressive arm swings that looked more like he was trying to fight invisible bees than prepare for swimming. He grunted loudly with each swing and kept checking to make sure everyone was watching his technique. Meanwhile, I quietly stretched my shoulders the way I'd done thousands of times before and dipped my hand in the water to check the temperature. Harper had her phone out filming everything and said loud enough for everyone to hear that she wanted to remember this moment forever. Craig heard that and flexed for the camera, saying she could use the video to show people what peak performance looked like. Harper's sister pulled me aside while Craig was distracted and apologized for his behavior, especially all the racist stuff he'd said earlier. Her face looked miserable, and I could tell she was realizing her boyfriend was about to embarrass himself in front of her whole family. I told her it wasn't her fault, and that Craig seemed to have some issues he needed to work through, but she still looked like she wanted to disappear. Craig called me back over and started explaining the rules to me like I was a 5-year-old who'd never been in a pool before. He used his hands to show me that one lap meant down to the other end and back, and that we'd be doing freestyle, which meant any stroke I wanted as long as I didn't touch the bottom or the lane lines. I nodded along patiently, while Harper stood behind him, barely containing her laughter at how ridiculous this whole thing was. Craig kept going, explaining that we'd start in the water since he didn't have starting blocks, and that meant pushing off the wall when someone said go. More people from the BBQ started showing up to watch, and Craig immediately played to the crowd, saying he'd try not to lap me, but sometimes his competitive nature just took over. Someone mentioned they should probably have towels ready for afterward, and I appreciated that at least a few people were being practical about this whole situation. Craig kept posing and flexing for the growing audience, while I just stood there waiting for him to finish his show. Finally, we both got in the water at opposite ends of the pool to get ready for push starts, and the water was actually colder than I expected, which made my muscles tense up for a second. Craig immediately started complaining that the cold water was throwing off his rhythm and his muscles weren't responding right, and maybe we should wait for it to warm up. Harper's dad said we were doing this now, or not at all, so Craig stopped complaining and got into position against the wall. I pushed off the wall in a slow practice start to show Craig what we were doing, my body remembering the motion even after 5 years away from competition. Craig watched me glide halfway across the pool before he tried his own practice start, which was basically him shoving off the wall with his feet while his arms flailed around randomly. He came up sputtering after 3 strokes and said he was just warming up and the real one would be different. Harper's dad stepped forward and offered to do the countdown for us since we needed someone neutral to call the start. Craig immediately demanded that we go on go instead of 3, because that's how real races work according to him. I nodded and agreed to whatever made him comfortable since it wouldn't change the outcome anyway. Harper grabbed my arm and pulled me to the side of the pool for a second, while Craig was adjusting his shorts. She asked if I was really okay doing this since Craig had been drinking and might try something stupid in the water. I told her I dealt with way worse at actual competitions, and one drunk guy wasn't going to be a problem. She squeezed my hand and went back to stand with her family, while Craig started doing more of his weird arm circles. Imani Wade, who was one of Harper's family friends, stepped forward with her phone and volunteered to time the race since she didn't know either of us that well. She positioned herself at what would be the finish line and pulled up the stopwatch app to get ready. Craig started arguing that we should do 50 yards, which meant down and back, but he nearly tripped just walking along the pool edge. Harper's dad and a few others immediately said 25 yards one way was enough given Craig's condition and the fact that his pool didn't have proper walls for turns. Craig grumbled about it giving me an advantage, but eventually agreed when his girlfriend told him to stop being difficult. That's when we heard someone calling from the fence, and this older guy named Ed Gilmore, who lived next door, came over asking what all the noise was about. When someone explained we were having a swimming race, Ed disappeared for a minute, then came back with an actual stopwatch from his garage. He said he used to time his grandson's swim meets and offered to help time as a completely neutral party since he didn't know either of us. Now we had 2 timekeepers, which made this whole thing feel more official than it needed to be. A couple of the teenagers started pulling pool toys and floating beer cans out of the lanes, while Craig and I took a few easy strokes to warm up. My warm-up was just smooth freestyle to get a feel for the water temperature and distance, while Craig's looked like he was trying to beat the water into submission. Every stroke sent huge splashes everywhere, and his legs kicked so wide that he almost hit the lane line with every movement. Harper's dad gathered everyone together and said he wanted this to stay respectful with no trash talk during the actual race. Harper's sister looked grateful that her dad was trying to keep things civil, even though Craig muttered something about not needing anyone to protect him. Then Craig started up again with his racist garbage saying black people can't swim because of science and offering to give me a 5-second head start. Before I could respond, Imani shut him down hard with actual facts about Cullen Jones winning Olympic gold and Simone Manuel breaking records that stood for years. She told Craig his science was just ignorance, and maybe he should learn some actual history before opening his mouth. Craig's face got red, and he mumbled something about exceptions to the rule, but everyone was clearly done listening to him. I caught Harper's eye across the pool, and she gave me a small nod that said she understood this was about more than just winning a race now. The crowd had grown to about 15 people, all standing around the pool edge, waiting to see what would happen next. Someone had even brought out more towels and set them on the chairs, which I thought was pretty practical considering how this was likely to end. Craig kept stretching and posing like he was at the Olympics himself, while I just stood quietly in the water getting my breathing ready. The water felt good against my skin, and my muscles were starting to remember what they used to do every single day for years. Ed and Imani compared their timing devices to make sure they were synced up and ready to go. Harper's dad asked us both one more time if we were ready to do this safely and responsibly. Craig rolled his eyes and said he was born ready, while I just nodded and got into position at the wall. My hands gripped the pool edge the same way they had hundreds of times before in actual competitions that mattered. Craig tried to copy my position, but his form was all wrong with his butt too high and his head looking straight ahead instead of down. The whole crowd went quiet as Harper's dad raised his hand to start the countdown, and I felt that familiar calm wash over me that always came right before a race. Craig suddenly stood up and started pounding his chest with both fists like some kind of gorilla while making these loud whooping noises that echoed across the pool area. Everyone just stared at him as he kept beating his chest harder and harder, his face turning red from the effort and the alcohol. Harper's mom covered her mouth with her hand, and I heard one of the cousins whisper something about calling an Uber for him later. Craig finished his display by throwing his arms up and letting out this primal scream that made the neighbor's dog start barking from 2 houses over. He stumbled slightly as he got back into position at the pool edge, still breathing heavy from his performance. Harper's dad cleared his throat and raised his hand again to start the countdown, speaking clearly and slowly so there would be no confusion. "On your marks," he said, and we both gripped the pool edge with our fingers curled under the lip. "Get set," he continued, and I coiled my muscles like a spring while Craig just kind of crouched awkwardly. Harper's dad took a breath and started to say go, but Craig launched himself into the water before the word even left his mouth. Water exploded everywhere as Craig thrashed into the pool, while Ed immediately called out, "False start," and waved his arms to stop everything. Craig came up sputtering and immediately started arguing that he definitely heard the word go, even though literally everyone else was shaking their heads. "The pressure got to me," Craig complained as he swam back to the wall, water streaming down his face. We reset our positions and Harper's dad made sure to speak even louder and clearer this time around. Craig kept fidgeting and adjusting his shorts while I just stayed perfectly still, waiting for the real start. "On your marks, get set, go!" Harper's dad called out, and this time we both pushed off clean and legal. My body remembered exactly what to do as I drove off the wall with my legs and stretched into my first stroke. The water felt perfect against my skin as I pulled through with my right arm, then my left, finding that rhythm I'd practiced thousands of times. Craig was already creating massive splashes next to me, his arms windmilling through the water like he was trying to fight off a swarm of bees. By my 5th stroke, my muscle memory had completely taken over, and I was gliding through the water like the past 5 years had never happened. I could hear the muffled cheers from above the water as I smoothly rotated my body with each stroke, my kick steady and controlled. Craig's splashing got louder and more desperate as I pulled ahead, his breathing getting ragged and gasping with every stroke attempt. I touched the wall with a smooth reach and stood up calmly while Craig was still struggling through the last 5 yards. He finally slapped the wall with both hands, gasping and wheezing like he'd just run a marathon instead of swimming 25 yards. Ed called out the times clearly for everyone to hear. Mine was actually pretty decent considering I hadn't trained in years, while Craig's was about what you'd expect from someone who could barely swim. Craig immediately grabbed the pool edge and started making excuses between gasps for air. "The beer threw off my balance," he wheezed, then added something about his stomach being too full from the burgers. He clutched his side dramatically and claimed he'd gotten a sudden cramp halfway through, which explained everything apparently. Before anyone could respond, Craig pushed off the wall and declared that freestyle wasn't his best stroke anyway. "Butterfly," he announced, still breathing heavy. "That's my signature stroke. Let's go again with butterfly." Harper's sister tried to grab his arm and tell him to stop, but he was already insisting that butterfly was where his true talent showed. Several people pointed out that butterfly while drunk could actually be dangerous, but Craig waved them off with water flying from his hands. Harper's dad suggested we should only go the width of the pool for safety if we were really doing butterfly. Craig complained that the shorter distance gave me an advantage somehow, but finally agreed when everyone insisted on safety first. We moved to the side of the pool where it was only about 15 feet across instead of the full 25-yard length. Craig kept trying to demonstrate his butterfly technique while standing in the water, his arms swinging wildly and hitting the water with loud slaps. I just waited quietly at the wall, knowing exactly how this was about to go down. Ed and Imani repositioned themselves at the opposite side with their timing devices, ready for the width-wise sprint. Harper's dad gave us another countdown, and we pushed off for the butterfly demonstration. I kept my form tight and controlled, my arms sweeping forward together while my legs did the dolphin kick I'd perfected years ago. Craig managed maybe 2 actual butterfly strokes before his coordination completely fell apart, and he started doing something that looked like a mix between doggy paddle and actually drowning. Water went everywhere as he thrashed and gasped, his arms moving at different times and his legs kicking randomly. I touched the far wall without even needing to take a breath while Craig was still flailing in the middle of the pool. He finally made it to the wall and clung to it with both hands, coughing and spitting out water. Craig's face was bright red as he started yelling that Ed must have messed up the timing somehow. Ed calmly read out both times again from his stopwatch and even showed Craig the display. Even Craig couldn't argue with a 12-second difference in a widthwise sprint that should have taken maybe 8 seconds total. Harper's sister finally lost it and grabbed Craig by the arm, pulling him away from the pool while water dripped everywhere. We could all hear her telling him he was embarrassing both himself and her in front of her entire family. Craig kept insisting the pool must be different dimensions than what he ordered, which made absolutely no sense to anyone listening. He tried to pull away from her to measure the pool, but she kept dragging him toward the chairs. Harper came over to me as I climbed out of the pool and grabbed the towel someone handed me. She whispered quickly that I shouldn't say anything about my Olympic background yet, because she wanted Craig to stew in his loss without having that excuse. I nodded and walked back over to where we'd left the grill area earlier, grabbing a cold beer from the cooler. Everyone else stayed by the pool discussing what had just happened, their voices carrying across the yard as Craig continued his complaints about pool dimensions and false starts. Craig stumbled back over to where I stood drying off with the towel, his face still red from both the exertion and embarrassment. He cleared his throat and said, "I swam pretty good for someone who never competed," which made everyone within earshot stop talking. I set down my beer and looked him straight in the eye. I told him calmly that his comments about black swimmers were racist and completely wrong. The whole group went dead quiet as I kept my voice steady and explained that claiming black people can't swim because of biology is ignorant. I mentioned that plenty of black swimmers have won Olympic medals and broken world records. Craig's mouth opened and closed like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Imani stepped forward from where she'd been timing and backed me up immediately. She suggested Craig should apologize for the racist garbage he'd been spewing, not just the trash talk about swimming. Harper's dad moved closer and crossed his arms, his voice firm when he said there wouldn't be any more comments like that at his house. He made it crystal clear to everyone that racism wasn't welcome here. Period. Craig looked around for support, but found none, even his girlfriend turning away from him. Someone turned the music back on to break the tension, and people started drifting away from the pool area. Groups reformed around the food tables and grill, conversations resuming at lower volumes. I walked back to the grill and picked up the spatula, flipping the burgers that had been sitting there untouched. People kept coming up to me one by one, quietly saying they were impressed with my swimming and how I'd handled everything. A couple of Harper's cousins mentioned they had no idea I could swim like that. Her aunt patted my shoulder and whispered that Craig had it coming. I just nodded and thanked them, focusing on getting the food ready since people were getting hungry. Harper found me at the grill, and we had a quiet moment away from everyone else. She said she was proud of how I'd handled everything without stooping to his level or getting aggressive. I could have humiliated him way worse, but chose not to, and she appreciated that. We talked briefly about my swimming background, and agreed I might tell her family about it eventually. Tonight definitely wasn't the right time for that conversation, though. Ed came over while I was plating burgers and thanked me for keeping things safe in the pool. He mentioned he actually runs a small swimming clinic for neighborhood kids on Saturday mornings. He'd clearly recognized my technique and suggested I might want to help out sometime if I was interested. I told him I'd think about it, genuinely considering the idea of teaching kids who actually wanted to learn. He gave me his number and said no pressure, just thought I might enjoy it. Meanwhile, Imani was checking on Harper's sister to make sure she had a safe way home. Craig was obviously way too drunk to drive anywhere, and his girlfriend looked mortified by the whole situation. They worked out a plan where Harper's dad would drive them both home later. Craig's car would stay in the driveway overnight, and he could get it tomorrow when he sobered up. Harper's sister kept apologizing to people for bringing him, clearly embarrassed by his behavior. About 20 minutes later, Craig came back over to where I was serving food. He'd sobered up slightly from the swim and his girlfriend's anger, though he still swayed a bit. He mumbled something about getting carried away and said he was sorry if he'd been a jerk. I accepted his apology without making a big deal about it, just nodding and handing him a burger. We both knew he didn't really understand why what he'd said was wrong, but at least he tried. His girlfriend grabbed his arm and pulled him away before he could say anything else stupid. Later in the evening, some kids from the neighborhood who'd seen the race came over asking questions. They wanted to know about swimming techniques and how to go faster in the water. I gave them a few casual pointers about keeping their heads down and breathing to the side. I showed them how to cup their hands properly and explained about kicking from the hips, not the knees. They practiced the motions on the grass, and I corrected their form gently without mentioning my competitive background. One kid asked if I'd teach them sometime, and I said maybe, thinking about Ed's clinic. The party wound down as the sun started setting and people began heading home. Craig and Harper's sister left with Harper's dad driving. Craig slumped in the back seat looking miserable. Harper and I stayed to help clean up, collecting plates and cups while her mom packed up leftover food. Everyone kept bringing up the race, shaking their heads at Craig's behavior and complimenting my composure. Harper's mom hugged me and said I was welcome anytime, which meant a lot. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Ed about his swimming clinic. He sent details about the program he runs for kids who can't afford regular swim lessons. It meets every Saturday at the community center pool from 9 to 11. He said I could just stop by one session to check it out, no commitment necessary. I texted back that I'd come by next Saturday to see what it was about. Teaching kids who actually wanted to learn seemed like it might be rewarding. Later that afternoon, Harper's dad sent me a message that surprised me. He thanked me for handling Craig with class and not escalating the situation when I easily could have. He said he was always impressed by people who didn't need to brag about their abilities. He mentioned that Harper seemed happy with me, and that meant something to him. We ended up texting back and forth about swimming and sports in general, developing a better rapport than we'd had before. 3 days later, Harper's sister sent me a long text while I was at work, saying she and Craig were taking some space after what happened at the BBQ. She explained that seeing him act that way opened her eyes to other stuff she'd been ignoring, and they needed to figure things out. I texted back that she didn't need to apologize for anything, and that I hoped things worked out however was best for her. Harper told me later that her sister was really torn because Craig kept saying he was just drunk and competitive, but she couldn't forget the racist stuff he said. 2 weeks passed before the next family dinner at Harper's parents' house, and I noticed Craig's usual spot at the table stayed empty. Harper's mom served the pot roast, and then asked me about my swimming background since everyone kept talking about the race. I took a sip of water and mentioned I swam at Stanford for 4 years and had some good races there. Her dad nodded and said that explained a lot about my form in the pool. I left it at that and changed the subject to Harper's new project at work. The whole family seemed satisfied with that simple answer, and nobody pushed for more details, which I appreciated. That same week, I found myself driving past the community center and decided to stop in and check out their pool hours. The chlorine smell hit me as soon as I walked through the doors, and something about it made me smile. I signed up for a monthly pass right there and started going 3 mornings a week before work. The first time back in the water felt strange after 5 years away, but my body remembered the motions. I wasn't trying to hit any times or train for anything specific, just moving through the water at whatever pace felt good. Other early morning swimmers would nod hello, and we'd share lanes without any drama or competition. The lifeguard mentioned my stroke looked professional, and I just said thanks and kept swimming. Those morning swims became my favorite part of the day, where I could just exist in the water without any pressure. A month later, Harper's family had another barbecue, and someone had printed out pool rules and taped them to the fence as a joke. The list included stuff like no racing under the influence and no biology lessons required, and everyone got a good laugh out of it. Harper's dad started calling me Coach when I walked in, and pretty soon everyone picked it up as a friendly nickname. I manned the grill again and noticed Harper's sister showed up alone looking more relaxed than she had in months. She came over to thank me for being cool about everything and mentioned she and Craig had officially broken up the week before. The afternoon went smooth with kids splashing in the pool and adults sitting around talking about normal stuff. Nobody brought up swimming or racing, and I was perfectly happy keeping my Olympic background to myself for now. Well, folks, that's all from me today. Thanks for letting me toss in my clever little observations along the way. Until we meet again, stay sharp. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.